Hi, everyone. Happy winter solstice. It's December 21st, the shortest day of the year. And boys and girls, ask your families about what's happening tonight. There's a big event in the sky tonight, okay? Two planets, Jupiter and Saturn, are going to be close, and they're going to put out this gigantic light. And some people are calling it the Christmas light. And it's happening tonight, about 6 o'clock, I think. So we'll all be awake and we can see it. And it's going to be beautiful. And I've got my coat and hat on because we are still reading I Survived the Children's Blizzard 1888. So I'm dressing for Blizzard. All right, we are very close to finishing this book, right? We're on chapter 18. And let's get right back to it. Okay, they're close to somebody's farm, but they all jumped from a speeding sled, right? Which had to have been scary. All right, precious minutes ticked by and none of them moved. It was getting colder. But down here, close to the ground, the wind wasn't quite as strong. The air wasn't as thick with swirling snow. John managed to wipe frozen snow from his eyes, which is why he saw it, the outline of something very big just a few yards ahead. "That's the house!" John shouted. They all lunged forward, crawling desperately through the snowdrifts. John's heart pounded with excitement. They'd make it! They'd be safe! The boys pushed themselves along, fighting their way forward, and it wasn't until they were just inches away that they saw that it wasn't the Ricker house. It was a big haystack. Okay, that's how hard the snow is coming down that they couldn't even tell it wasn't a house. It's a big haystack, and they thought it was a house. Peter let out a big sob. Rex cursed and looked around. "The house must be this way," he shouted. Rex stepped forward, but John grabbed the back of his jacket and pulled him back. "No!" John shouted. John might not be a real pioneer like Rex. This was only his second Dakota winter, but he knew this for sure. They'd never find the Ricker house, not in time. They had to get out of this wind and snow. They had to try to get warm. Inside the haystack. Wow. That's interesting, huh? John remembered the fox that had hidden in their haystack overnight. Didn't Rex say that animals were always right? John turned to Rex. "We won't make it," he shouted over the wind. "We have to take cover in here." And now John took the lead. He punched a hole through the thick crust of snow and ice that covered the haystack. He reached through and grabbed fistfuls of the soft hay to make space. All right, I know since we all live kind of out in the country, you probably have seen the giant haystacks out in fields, right? After farmers have used their, I don't even know what, a type of tractor or something, to roll the hay. So what they're doing is they're pulling out the insides of the big haystack. Grab fistfuls of the soft hay to make space. Rex and Peter and Sven were helping him. They worked desperately, jabbing their hands in, pulling out hay. They all worked together until they had a little cave big enough for them to fit in. And then they crawled in, lying flat and squeezed together. It was still freezing cold. John's numb hands and feet felt like blocks of wood. He couldn't stop shivering, but finally the cruel wind couldn't reach them. The ice and snow couldn't tear at their faces, and soon the heat from their bodies started to warm up the small space. "Don't sleep," Rex said. John had heard what happened to people who fell asleep in the freezing cold. They never woke up. That's why freezing to death wasn't the worst way to die, he'd heard, because you'd fall asleep before your heart stops. And so now they fought hard against sleep, just like they'd fought against wind and snow. They took turns telling stories. They counted to 1,000, and then they did it again backward. They said prayers. John told them the name of every player on the Chicago White Stockings. The hours passed. The blizzard raged on. They ran out of stories and got tired of counting, and then Peter started muttering in a strange rhyming way. And John realized he was reciting one of the long, boring poems Miss Rule had made them memorize. They all joined in, and then they recited another and another. They all knew so many. It turned out that not all of those poems were so boring. Some were about pirates and sailors. One was about the summer, and the words made John feel warmer. There were poems that made no sense, like the one about a pig wearing a wig, but it actually made them laugh. Those poems kept them up for hours more. But finally, their voices became ragged. Their words faded away. John's mind started to drift. Don't sleep, don't sleep. His eyes fluttered. Don't sleep, don't sleep. John's eyes shut. Don't sleep, don't. John's eyes stayed closed. Everything got quiet, even the sound of that screaming wind. Chapter 19. About 2 weeks later. So the storm has passed. Newspapers from New York to Seattle printed stories about the deadly blizzard that had struck America's northern prairie. It was one of the most powerful snowstorms ever to hit America. More like a frozen hurricane than a blizzard. Winds had reached 70 miles an hour. Temperatures had dipped down to minus 40. Oh my goodness. Cities like St. Paul, Minnesota and Lincoln, Nebraska were shut down. Towns were buried. Hundreds were dead. It was a blizzard so terrible that soon it had a name, the Children's Blizzard, because at least 100 of the people who died were school children. The newspapers were filled with sad and terrible stories about children who became trapped in the frozen, swirling winds. But there were miracles, too. Like how one teacher tied her 10 students together with a rope and led them to a farmhouse a half-mile away from their school, or the kids who made it through the night in a shelter they built from snow, or the brothers who huddled in a barn with 2 pigs that kept them warm. And the 4 boys from the tiny town of Prairie Creek, Dakota, who survived the blizzard in a haystack. Oh, wow. All right. Of course we knew our boys were going to survive. It is, I think, who said this? Maybe it was Ellis. It is, after all, called I Survived. So usually the main characters do make it. John didn't read any of those stories, not at first. For the first week after the blizzard, he wasn't sure if he was alive or dead. The storm had ended just a few minutes after he and the guys had fallen asleep. They'd been in that haystack almost all night. John was barely breathing when Mr. and Mrs. Ricker carried him and the other boys from the haystack into the farmhouse. When Ma and Pa got there later that day, he heard them calling his name. He felt their hands on him, but he couldn't open his eyes. He couldn't move or speak. He felt locked away, caught in a frozen nightmare. Most of the time, he thought he was still in the haystack or curled into a snowdrift. That hissing blizzard still echoed in his ears. It wasn't until a week after the blizzard that John finally opened his eyes. It was the middle of the night, and it took him a long, panicked moment to understand that he wasn't in the haystack or in a frozen grave. He was in the warm soddy, tucked into his bed. Franny was curled up next to him, Pa dozing in a chair, Ma close by. Ma, John said in a crackling voice. The fire in the stove cast a golden glow, and John saw the tears in Ma's eyes as she smiled down at him. And that was the moment when, for John, the terrifying blizzard at last came to an end. Okay. Well, let's read on, because I want to read about, remember the first creature we met in this story? Okay, I wanted to read about him. Remember King Rattler? About 3 months later, Sunday, April 29th, 1888, Prairie Creek, Dakota Territory afternoon. The snow had melted. The prairie was slowly sprouting back to life. Bright green shoots pushed up through the brown grass. Enormous flocks of geese and ducks flapped across the blue sky. The winter was over. The birds were back. John and the guys had returned to school at the end of March, and now on this bright and warm day in April, here they were at the creek. They'd come for King Rattler. John had brought Pa's rifle this time. Rex clutched his axe, and Sven was ready with his stick. Peter had found a dead rabbit half eaten by a fox. That was the bait. King Rattler could attack from any direction, Rex reminded them, his voice strong but still raspy from months of coughing. He'd caught a bad case of pneumonia after the blizzard and looked too skinny and frail. They were all still healing. Sven lost 2 toes from frostbite and was walking with the cane. Peter had lost a pinky. I never liked that finger anyway, he swore. John's feet had been so badly frostbitten that he'd nearly lost them. His hands, too. His feet had swelled up like balloons. The skin on his hands and feet turned black. The pain was so terrible that he couldn't move. For days he was in bed, soaked in sweat and trying not to cry. But Ma kept telling him that the pain was good news and that it meant that blood was starting to flow again, that his hands and feet were coming back to life. She kept dosing John with Brown's bitters and gently rubbing his skin with some cream that smelled like rotten apples. So this was medicine, over 100 years ago. It's not like medicine we have now. All right. I think I'm going to stop there. Okay, boys and girls, we will finish out this story with the story about King Rattler. Dun, dun, dun. You'll see what happens to him. All right. I know this is kind of an intense story, but guys, I'm not going to see you again until 3rd grade. And I'm guessing Mrs. Sandlin has a lot of these. These I Survived books are really amazing because as scary as they can be, and a little intense too, they are based on true actual events that happened in our history. And this just happens to be one of them, okay? And it's about strong people who really fought hard to survive whatever it is they were surviving. So I will see you guys tomorrow to find out what happens to King Rattler. Goodbye.